I'll delete out.
Hi, I'm Dr. Peggy Semingson, and I'm an assistant professor of literacy studies.
And I'm Dr. Jodi Tommerdahl. I'm an associate professor of mind, brain, and education.
We're talking a little bit about what teachers need to know about teaching beginning reading. And so I've been thinking about this topic, and what do you think about what teachers absolutely need to know to teach beginning reading?
Now, this is a conversation that Dr. Semingson and I have a lot. We sit around sometimes over coffee and talk about what we really feel that the teachers that we're teaching need to know about literacy. So I have a few things in mind that I'd like to share with anybody who's listening to our webcast. And the first thing that I find that sometimes teachers are unaware of when they're teaching reading is not really being aware of what a single sound is, what we call phonemes in English. And often they match up a sound with a letter. And that doesn't always work in English, as you know. For example, sometimes we have a digraph, like a C and an H together, that'll make a single sound. So it doesn't work just to match up a single sound to a single letter. Being English doesn't work like that. And another example that often comes up is when I talk to teachers about what single sounds are. Of course they know most of them, like b, d, t, g, all of those. But then you come up something like, you come up with an X and you say, the sound that this letter makes is x, and that's two sounds. And often students will disagree with me and say, no, that X is a single sound, x, and I'll say, no, it's definitely two. There's the k and the s in succession. And just little things like that that aren't noticed sometimes. If the teachers aren't aware of it themselves, they'll have a difficult time passing it on to the children and making sure that the children are able to dissect a word into all of its individual sounds, which is really important when you're learning how to read and even when you're learning how to speak.
I agree. The stronger our knowledge is, the more confidence and expertise we bring, and even when teaching kindergarten, first grade readers.
Yeah, and another thing that I thought of is, and I know most teachers are already very well aware of this, but you can never be just too back to the basics, I think, is about clearly explaining the difference to kids that letters have a name and they have a sound that they make. And a lot of times they seem really close together. For example, the letter B. The name of it is B, and it starts with B, and which is the sound that it makes. But you think about a letter like W. Its name is W, but it doesn't make the sound W, it makes the sound W, and the W is nowhere to be found in W. And I think that can be really confusing to kids when they're talking about, they get the question, what is this letter? And they're thinking, well, sometimes it's a W, sometimes it's a W, but they can't quite formulate that thought. So I think it's just good to make it clear that each letter has a name and it has a sound that goes with it.
Yeah, that sounds so basic, but I've had 3rd and 4th graders ask me the name of the letter W or U and get mixed up, and so they continue to have alphabet issues if they never got it in the first place.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of foundational things that probably most children will pick up without ever thinking of it, but if they don't, it's a real help if you can make things explicit. So yeah, you can't really overteach the basics as far as I'm concerned.
Naming it. Well, cool. Anything else you want to add?
Well, one thing that's probably not going to apply to most children, but between 5 and 10% of children do have some kind of reading or language impairment, and the signs are really hard to pick out. So I just wanted to put my 2 cents in about signs, very early signs of language delay or language impairment that teachers and parents can recognize. And one of those is, well, if you know the child very early in their lives, if they're not speaking as early as other children, that's also a question you can ask parents and say, did they start talking later than their brothers and sisters did? When did they say their first words? And sometimes you'll hear the parents say, well, they're fine now, but they didn't say their first word until they were 2 years old, and that could set off a little warning bell of this is something to watch. Also, if there are behavioral difficulties that are unexplained, sometimes it's due to a language problem. And let me see, any language difficulties that are in the family, that is a big warning bell, because these things are hereditary. Boys are more likely to have dyslexia and language impairment than girls at a rate of about 4 to 1.
Wow.
So that's something to be aware of. Also, if you have a child who just doesn't speak much, they might be shy, but a very small amount of language being produced can be a sign. of a child's discomfort using language, maybe because of either comprehension or production problems. So shyness can mask a language problem. Another thing to look for is very specific morphemes in words that sometimes tend to disappear when a child has a language impairment. Things like this, that final sounds on plurals, the past tense, and the third person singular. So if I say, I walk versus she walks, that ends on the walks. Sometimes children will leave those off, and that can be a sign of specific language impairment.
Morphemes, okay. Well, good stuff to know. I wanted to add to that. I think teachers need to know the stages or the processes, not only the building blocks like you were talking about, but the stages or processes of reading development. I think a lot of the debates and fights over how children learn to read come from a misunderstanding of how reading develops. And so we know from Jean Chall, a Harvard scholar, that she writes in stages of reading development, children move from holistic experiences as emergent readers, and as they become real readers and learn the alphabetic principle, they need to learn the code. And so she takes a code-centered approach, but then children move into and become fluent, and they move into connected text or real text. So it's not that phonics is the be-all end-all, but it's kind of a means to an end, if you will, in the process of learning to read, I think.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, and I look at it from kind of a neural perspective and a psychological perspective, where you have different ways of processing a word. Even when we're fully developed, experienced readers, we still have our pathway that looks at chunks of letters together, either an entire word or chunks of a word, and recognize it in its entirety. And then we also have that decoding ability, so we switch back and forth between them all the time, and children develop them and use both just like we do.
Yeah, it's just one more tool children can use. So as you learn more about phonics, keep in mind it's just one component of language and literacy. So yeah, thanks for talking.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.
Great, good.
Very cool.